The Russian intrusion into the Aleutians was a violent conquest. It wasn't just hunters showing up living with Aleuts. They'd conquered Siberia with a handful of men, so they had it down. And you go in, you terror, murder, captives, extortion, and they applied that in the Aleutians. And I mean, whole villages would gone. And they didn't just kill people, they would destroy boats, weapons.
They would burn everything.
Scorched earth.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is archeologist Debra Corbett. After 7 years in the 1980s scouting ancient burial grounds all across Alaska for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Debbie got her master's degree at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where she specialized in Aleutian archaeology. She had already spent time in the Aleutian Islands and knew that this region and its people were her passion. 40 years later, she and fellow archaeologist Diane Hanson have written the definitive textbook on the Aleutian Islands and its people, Culture and Archaeology of the Ancestral Unangax Aleut of the Aleutian Islands, Alaska, published by Springer in 2025. Debra Corbett, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. This is very exciting.
So where were you born?
Actually, I was born in Idaho, but my parents were living in Oregon at the time.
What was your childhood like?
Pretty normal, middle-class, white American. My mom was a nurse. My dad worked for Safeway as a meat cutter. I had a brother and a sister. We were pretty feral. You know, in the 60s and 70s, parents just don't bother us, come home at dinner. We went camping a lot. I was really introverted, bookish. My sister remembers our childhood very differently because she was way more active and social. And I was apparently pretty oblivious to things going on around me, but I read a lot, spent time by myself, either outside or inside.
You're the first archaeologist that we've had on the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, you're the only archaeologist that I've ever met.
Oh, okay.
And I mean, literally, for me, if you said, what's your reference for archaeology, I would say Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so I'm curious, did you know what an archaeologist was? And were you interested in archaeology?
My mom said that when I was 6 or 7, I announced that I was going to be an archaeologist. I have no idea where I learned the word. I have no idea where I learned what that was, but I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I didn't actively pursue that. I read a lot, but I didn't volunteer for excavations. I didn't go to museums, and volunteer and work in labs or anything like that until I went off to college.
Where'd you go to college?
University of Arizona in Tucson.
And was your major archaeology? Did they have that as a major?
It's an anthropology major, and there are 4 fields: archaeology, physical anthropology, which is the biology and evolution of humans, linguistics, and cultural anthropology, which is the ethnography, people going into the field, living with other groups, coming back and reporting on those. So my degree is in anthropology with the specialization of archaeology. And actually, I somehow had the presence of mind to split my major between archaeology and cultural anthropology. Because really, archaeology is the tool for learning about how humans lived in the past. It's called a materialistic science because we're focused on objects that people left behind, and you can really get caught up in measuring stone tools or describing pottery in excruciating detail. But the actual goal is to understand what people were doing and how they were doing it. And the hardest part is why they were doing what they were doing. Yeah, the degree is anthropology.
And did you go straight to grad school or?
No, Tom and I got married in 1980. We ended up in Idaho working. I went to work for
Did y'all meet in Arizona?
We met at school in Arizona. And we graduated in 80, and he got a job in Idaho, and then I followed him and worked for the Bureau of Land Management in Idaho. And then he got a job in Alaska And so I followed him up here, and that was in 83, and ANCSA had just passed, I think, in 80.
And he's a miner, a
Geologist.
geologist.
Yeah.
I knew he worked in mining.
Yes. He's a exploration geologist. So his specialty is looking for ore deposits to develop into mines. And he had some good jobs up here. I followed, because of ANCSA, there's a clause in ANCSA that allowed the native corporations, the regional corporations, to claim historic and cemetery sites that fell outside of their land allotments. And our job at the BIA was to investigate those claims, locate them on the ground, get their stories, document them, so they could be conveyed to the native corporations. That was an amazing job because it took us all over the state, into really remote areas. We were living in villages with people, interviewing elders, taking elders out to the sites, and did that for about 7 years.
Your first 7 years in Alaska?
Yes.
Had you had any interest in Alaska before Tom got the job here?
Actually, in high school, my best friend and I talked about coming to Alaska. And I'd actually researched the University of Alaska, but that kind of faded. And I was in Arizona, and I thought, well, this is where I'll work. And then we both had seasonal work up here. We did that for a couple of years, and then it just became pretty obvious that this is where the opportunities were. This is where the work was. The work was really interesting, unlike anything going on anywhere else. So we took the plunge in 85 and bought a house, this one, and we've been here ever since.
So I refer to you as an archaeologist. Your degree was in anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a mistake if you call an archaeologist an anthropologist or an anthropologist an archaeologist? And what's the difference?
It's not a mistake to call an archaeologist an anthropologist, but that's a sub-discipline of anthropology. Not all anthropologists are archaeologists.
Gotcha.
Although a lot of them, cultural anthropologists, linguists, and physical anthropologists, will work as archaeologists because that's where the majority of the jobs lie.
An archaeologist is somebody who's literally pulling things out of the ground.
Yes.
And so it's possible to be an anthropologist and not literally go out in the field and pull things out of the ground.
Exactly, yes. And there are prehistoric archaeologists who focus on people with no written record. There are historic archaeologists, and that's kind of a fuzzy, weird dividing line because archaeologists also study people in literate societies who leave no records. For example, people who study enslaved people in the American South before the Civil War, or the Chinese workers on the railroads. They left no written records, but they left a rich material culture. And that's often the only way we can get a picture into those people's lives, was from what they left behind. They were left out of the written.
So after you did your 7 years at BIA, then what happened?
I got bored and restless and went to grad school in Fairbanks. 3 years in Fairbanks. They had a couple of people who were specialists in the Aleutians. Dr. Lydia Black was a cultural anthropologist who studied mainly the modern culture, but also tried to extend what she learned into the past to reconstruct the earlier beliefs and practices. And Dr. Jean Eigner, who had been working in the Aleutians since the 70s, I believe. Dr. Doug Veltri was working down here, but Anchorage didn't have a graduate program at the time. So he was down here. I had to go to Fairbanks to get the degree.
And had you already decided that your interest was in the Aleutians? And that was from your work at BIA?
Yes. My first summer at BIA, they sent 2 crews to the Aleutians. We went to Adak, which had a runway, but we were working on the west and southwest sides of the island. So they gave us a Zodiac, a couple of motors, all the stuff we needed to work, and sent us out there and said, don't die. We had 2 days of boat training in Seward.
Wow. So you get on a boat and like
illusion.
a pretty aggressive and crazy sea
Yes.
and just go around to about where you think you're supposed to be.
We got the Navy to take us around and drop us off. There were some hunting cabins on the island. So I was in a place called the Bay of Islands. There was a shack, and it was a shack. The other crew was in Three Arm Bay, which was farther south, and that cabin had burned down earlier, so it had been rebuilt by the military. So it was actually a pretty nice cabin.
But you were by yourself in the shack?
There were 6 of us on the crew, 6 or 7. The shack slept 3 people. I mean, we opened the door and the woman I was with said, "I'll get the shovel and you do this." And we just went in and started throwing things out the door.
Wow.
To
try to make
it habitable. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot in the early part of your book just about the extreme struggle it is to do archaeology in the Aleutians.
Yes.
Because of the extraordinary expense of getting to sites, the variability of whether or not you could actually make it to the site.
Yes.
So
And the cost, you've got to get to ADAC, or because I was working with Fish and Wildlife Service after my graduate degree, we could get access to Shemya, which is farther out. But those are not ideal islands to work on because of the construction, the occupation. There's a lot of damage. So then you've got to get to a place where the work is going to be worth it. And with the BIA work on ADAC, we had the Navy support. After that, we had the Fish and Wildlife Service had just gotten a research vessel, and BIA would charter with the Fish and Wildlife Service and drive us around. But we were kind of at the mercy of the refuge priorities are their work. So we had to schedule in between when they were dropping crews off, supporting crews, and things like that. It's one of the places we worked on Bull Deer is 2 full days from ADAC, and you're just on a boat, and if it's rough, you're on your back in a bunk on the boat. And then when you get to shore, the deckhands are skiffing you to shore, and you're putting everything you need for 2 weeks, 3 months into these skiffs and getting it to shore, and then carrying it up the beach, and then building a camp. And then 3 days after you get there, then you start your work. So it's...
and then it's a very short season. You're not going to be able to stay there for a year.
No. I think our longest excavations with BIA, we were out for a summer. They plopped us out there. They came back, or we came back in September. So we had a long period of time, but the job wasn't excavation. It was finding these sites, documenting them, and moving on to the next one. And we had, I think the Aleut Corporation had claimed 300 or more sites.
I'm going to make some generalizations. You can kind of correct me.
Okay.
But to me, it seems like that sometimes it's kind of like when people they've dropped something and they're looking for it where the light is. Not, you know what I mean? So a lot of times I feel like you're excavating where you can get to.
Exactly.
And how did the Aleut Corporation know where these 300 sites were? And are there others they didn't know about?
Oh, yes. There had been some archaeologists out there from the 1880s, not really archaeologists then, but naturalists and explorers. And they had recorded some sites. But when ANCSA was passed, the Aleut Corporation paid a couple of young men from Massachusetts who had worked with Bill Laughlin, one of the early, he was out there in the 50s. He worked with Alish Hrdlichka, who was an anthropologist of the Smithsonian Institution who came to the Aleutians looking for human remains. Bill Laughlin.
And that's the I don't know how to say the name again. Hrdlichka?
Hrdlichka.
That's the one who had the theory about pre-Aleuts.
Yes.
And then that became Paleo-Aleuts versus Neo-Aleuts based on the
skull shape.
And then I love this part of the book, and I'm just going to go there and talk about it, because what's interesting is it was basically refuted that basing this whole theory on three skulls or.
Well, yes, he had worked in Kodiak, and he found two populations there with different skull shapes. And I don't remember what he called those. So when he came to the Aleutians, he was looking for the same thing. And he found round-headed and long-headed people.
So it was like confirmation bias. He was looking for something to prove his theory.
Yes.
What's interesting, though, you say that although it was refuted, I don't know, 4 or 5 decades ago, because he had a lot of graduate students, his theories persisted. Whereas the researcher who had refuted it didn't have a lot of graduate students. So it's almost like you can make the analogy between the people themselves, the way culture persists. I mean, like you had this theory that this type of culture through this one researcher that was persisting because of his descendants.
Yes, and exactly. You have a family tree of your grad students are your legacy. And Hrdlicka had, I think he had about 9, he called them the boys. He had the bunch of boys. Alan May and Bill Laughlin were the only two that continued archaeological work in the Aleutians. Laughlin was a physical anthropologist. He was looking at the skeleton, the human biology. He also looked at modern living Aleuts, but looking at their skeletal remains. And yes, the Paleo-Aleut, Hrdlicka called them pre-Aleut and Aleut. And it was a replacement. Suddenly this influx of new people came in, and they were the Aleuts. They replaced the pre-Aleuts. That's not the case. It's a lot more complex. They also, all the early researchers, and Bill Laughlin was the chief proponent, a group of people moved into the Aleutian Islands, and they stayed, and no one else came in behind them. So they were isolated in this appendix at the end of the world, and they developed in isolation, and they're totally unique. And they have some very interesting, they have a genetic signature that is unlike any other Native American.
Which you go into in the book.
Yes.
I can't quote it off the top of my head, but the alpha and the delta and
my colleague Diane Hanson did the research on that, because there's a lot of conflicting bits and it's little scraps that you hear about here and there. So she had to gather all those scraps and then distill them into something that makes sense to us. The thing with this is, we were distilling everybody else's work. We may not be right, but this is what we see the evidence telling us.
In 2023, or whenever you finish the book.
Yes. And while we were doing it, there was a major excavation going on at Chernovsky Harbor on Unalaska, ongoing work in the Unalaska Bay area. Little tidbits are coming in from that, but we have to stop somewhere.
So the book, we're talking about it now, you and your co-writer, Diane Hanson. Where did you see the need for the book?
She and I were both on ADAC in 1983, and we shared the obsession with the Aleutians. And we kind of joked about it, that someone needs to write this. Someone needs to write about this. And I was getting ready to retire from my job at Fish and Wildlife Service, and she said, "Hey, let's write a book on the Aleutians. It'll be fun." Yeah, that sounds great. And it took 10 years.
I can understand why. So what I'm going to have you do is just read a couple of passages from your book, Culture and Archeology of the Ancestral Unangax Aleut of the Aleutian Islands, Alaska. And I'm going to have you read about your approach to writing the book first.
Okay. And it's actually a section called Our Approach to Writing This Book. The canonical picture of Aleutian Island archaeology, while never uncritically accepted by all researchers, is in fact based on a flimsy framework. As we learned while writing this book, many conclusions of Aleutian archaeology are a house of cards built on incompletely analyzed data, starry-eyed assumptions, and deeply entrenched preconceived notions. The culture is presented as a lifeless, mechanical sketch. Most of the standard sources are at least 40 years old, and the best archaeological references are by Jokelson and McCartney. This is an exciting time to be working in the Aleutian Islands. Research since the 1980s has demolished the prevailing one-dimensional view and replaced it with one featuring dynamic, creative people living complex lives in a rich, challenging world. Entrenched opinions have been challenged by independent researchers, and new research is yielding exciting new data. We no longer have to recycle the information found in old reports. Still, far too much of the recent work is underreported or in limited circulation. There's a critical need for a presentation of the current state of knowledge. Our biggest goal for this book has been to integrate new information with the old in a readable form, accessible to the broadest possible audience. Along the way, we debunk old myths. To add flesh and life to the sterile, dry bones of archaeology, we used ethnohistoric records, ethnological information from Aleut neighbors, oral histories, and folklore. Much of this is presented with a certainty we certainly do not completely feel. All conclusions, assertions, and interpretations here are based on our analysis of the best available information. Additional research could turn our facts to myths. If our ideas stimulate others to launch fieldwork and analysis to challenge our conclusions, we will revel in their findings.
Thank you. I love the book, and I think it is really, really readable.
Okay.
And I think it is accessible to the broadest possible audience.
We were hoping. It's really hard to write for a specialist audience and for graduate students and for college classes and for Aleut people living in villages. For a lot of our friends have, it's like, wow, this is really great. This is wonderful. Not many people have read it straight through.
Right. Well, it's hard. I mean, it's dense isn't the right word because each section is readable in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, when you're talking about 300 million years ago, or, and plate tectonics.
Yes.
And then talking about the science, the chemistry of so many things.
Yes. DNA is really complicated.
Yeah.
And carbon dating is it's superficially simple, but it's not.
Right.
And just human behavior is really complex. We were limited to most of our information is from one small area of the Aleutian chain, and trying to make that broadly applicable to an area that's 1,000 miles long.
Mm-hmm. I want to have you read one more section. Okay. And this was just about sort of the stress for me, because I had interviewed Michael Livingston last week about the term Unangax versus Aleut, and then me getting really nervous about which one I'm supposed to say. And so you have a little section about that.
Yes, that is a really hard topic. And there are political, social, economic implications for all of these words. Words are really important. And it took a lot of research to come up with a fairly short section. Unangax is the Aleut word for Aleut. Ethnicity and tribe are modern, controversial, and poorly defined terms used to categorize people. The people of the Aleutian Islands recognized their common biological, cultural, and linguistic heritage, but did not conceive of themselves as a single nation. Geography, dialect, cultural differences, and alliances split people into multiple independent and overlapping groups. People identified themselves by kin group, home village, island residence. Boundaries were fluid and porous. Russians recognized the similarities among the people of the Aleutian Islands and borrowed a single term, Aleut, to define them. The term was eventually applied to groups on the Alaska Peninsula at Bristol Bay, Kodiak, and Prince William Sound. By the end of the 19th century, Aleut encompassed people of multiple ethnic groups and 3 languages who share a common Russian-influenced culture. The term had legal meaning in Russia. Aleuts were Christian subjects. They formed the economic backbone of the Russian colonial enterprise.
Thank you. And I think you mentioned just when we were chatting that there are folks who born and raised in the Aleutian chain who they prefer the term Aleut.
They do prefer the term Aleut, and it was a symbol of their resistance to the colonialism. That was their identity, and it was resistance. More recently, Aleutian Island Aleut people have tried to establish their uniqueness from Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak, Prince William Sound, and those people are also working on their identity. The people in Kodiak call themselves Aleutic now. So people are trying to reclaim an identity that has 200 or more years of history being imposed. Mm-hmm. And that does have Russian Orthodoxy is a huge marker of the common term Aleut. So there are some very clear uniting features, but underlying that are very different, distinct cultures and traditions.
The genetic markers, this refuted theory about skull shapes, that's really all in the second half of the book. The first half of the book was just this amazing tour through science of the plate tectonics, the animals, the way carbon dating doesn't work in the Aleutians. Mm-hmm. Can you explain that part?
Carbon dating is actually pretty simple because everything absorbs carbon. When we're breathing, everything we eat, we take in carbon all the time and we send it out again. There's a tiny fraction of the carbon that we take in that is radioactive. That's C14. And when a living organism dies, that C14 starts to decay. And it has a known decay rate of, I think, 5,500 years. In 5,500 years, half the carbon in a body is gone. And so you can count the amount of carbon remaining in a piece of charcoal or a bone, and you get a number that tells you how old that carbon is. So it seems real simple, but there are a million things that can mess that up. And one is that the amount of atmospheric carbon is not stable, so it increases and decreases. So the carbon timescales we have been checked with tree rings and with Egyptian mummies, because we have known dates for some of these things. And so they call them calibration curves. You get a date, and then the lab punches that date in, and you get this chart that shows where your date fits in there. But in a marine environment, the ocean is a huge carbon sink, huge. And the carbon can be very old in the ocean because it's not being recycled. It's sitting there. So the animals in the ocean are taking in this old carbon, and they are cycling it up through. So plankton absorbs the carbon, then fish, then sea lions, then humans are getting this carbon. And so if you date a sea lion bone, you're dating old carbon.
Because they were eating things that the C14 had already decayed.
Yes.
And
yes.
so
it was, yeah.
So the mistake was made that things in the Aleutians were dated older than they actually were.
Yes.
Because they'd eaten old carbon.
Old carbon. Mm-hmm. And then there's questions about the accuracy of driftwood, because driftwood can drift around for years. So when you get a carbon sample, it's like, what exactly am I dating here? Am I dating driftwood that maybe floated for 200 years? Am I dating a sea lion that ate the marine carbon? And to figure out the marine carbon reservoir, you need to date multiple things from a single context. So on Buldir, it's a wet site. So there's leaves and sticks and twigs from the modern vegetation. There's also driftwood and there's also sea mammals. So we were fortunate enough to get samples like from a fire pit that had sea lion bones, that had driftwood charcoal, and that had sticks and twigs from the island. And we could date those.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can calculate how big the carbon reservoir is. And for the Western Aleutians, marine specimens consistently date 800 years older than the driftwood or the leaves and twigs from the island. So that told us that the driftwood dates are accurate.
So that just meant that they'd eaten a lot of old carbon.
Yes, but the animals, the fish, the shellfish, if you're dating that, you have to make that correction of 800 years. Carbon dating, people all, it's like, oh, it's a real date. It dates this thing. It's right here. Yes, but, and that sadly, that is, when you talk about archaeology, here's the conclusion, but. Virtually everything is, well, yes, this happened, but, and here's all the.
And I won't get it right, but it's something to do with the plates and creating a trench and downward pull.
And volcanoes will. Yes, volcanoes. And the reason Diane spent so much time on the environment is that it is dominating force out there. And it's not an environment most Americans are familiar with on any level.
Or Alaskans. I visited the Aleutians for the first time this summer, although, as Mike Livingston, who was on the podcast last week, pointed out, I technically didn't make it to the Aleutians. I went to a part that people call the Aleutians, but we didn't make it all the way to Alaska because of weather, and we really spent most of our time in Cold Bay, which is not technically
the Aleutians.
Correct.
Yeah.
But I'm sure it looks similar.
Yes.
And the crazy thing for me was just the fact that there were no trees. Page 99 in the book, and I guess this might be Diane's part, but about the sequoias between 10 million and 25 million years ago, that they found petrified sequoias. And then, so that was kind of interesting. But then they talked about, and I don't know who they quoted, Veniaminov.
The first priest in Alaska.
Yeah. That was it he who thought that the reason, like, people had supposed that it was the wind that made it impossible for trees to grow there. And he thought that actually the reason why the wind was the way it was because there were no trees there. And so they brought in all these spruce seedlings from Sitka and they tried to basically grow forests there. I found all this part very fascinating.
It is fascinating. The trees will grow, but they don't make saplings. They don't reproduce. There's the Adak National Forest on Adak is a little clump of trees that have been there since World War II. I think the tallest ones might be 20 feet tall. They have not spread beyond that initial clump of trees. And I don't know if anybody knows why the trees don't reproduce. It's a harsh place. I would think if they got big, they would break off. Maybe the seeds are blown out to sea. I don't know.
A couple more interesting things, and this might all be from Diane's section, but I'll ask anyway. They tried bringing in these saplings to try to grow, so they were basically introducing things from elsewhere.
Yes.
And then, of course, you had the rats that created Rat Island. You had fox farming, where you were bringing in animals that are not native.
Yes.
Sometimes purposely, sometimes accidentally.
Yes.
And even caribou.
Yes.
On Adak.
Caribou were brought to Adak. I think the rationale was it would be survival food if Adak was cut off, but it was also a recreational opportunity for the military folks on Adak. There are caribou reindeer on Atka, and I don't know the rationale. In the early 1900s, People were bringing in reindeer to get the natives to herd reindeer, and it didn't take most places. Reindeer herding is hard, and it's easier to shoot them. Foxes were brought in the early 1900s, and fox furs became very valuable, very popular. I think in the early 1900s, like the 1920s, Unang and Aleut people were some of the highest paid, they called them industrial workers in the United States because the furs were so valuable. People walked around with fistfuls of $100 bills when they sold their foxes. Rats were accidental.
Because huge problems, and people would like abandon islands because of the rat population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they ate, the Aleuts would start planting potatoes and turnips and a few things that would grow. The rats would destroy those. They burrow into walls there. When we were out there working, we were very meticulous about storing our food because we call them little tiny bears. If they get a meal, everybody moves in, and you're just fighting rats.
And did you end up having to fight rats?
We did on a couple of islands. We worked on Rat Island 2 or 3 seasons, and we'd set traps every night before going to bed. And I was always the last one to go to bed, and I could hear them going off. And then every night we'd set more traps, and every night you could hear them going off. It was like, oh. On ADAC, when I worked for BIA, we brought poison out because they were just everywhere. They were in everything. Scrabbling in the walls, scurrying around at night. You'd lay in bed thinking, I'm going to have one on my chest.
Right.
You know? Yeah. Not every island has rats, thank God. But any that had a major military presence, Kiska, ADAC, Chitka, Shemya doesn't have rats or mice because there are still people there and they aggressively
made sure they weren't there, yeah.
But they're very hard to get off, especially a big island. They have been removed from Rat Island, but that was one of the largest islands that had ever had rats removed.
It was also written in the book about the biggest harms to archaeological sites was hoofed animals, and there had been attempts to do cattle, to do sheep, to do goats, I think. I mean, there were some really bad decisions.
Horses. Most of that is in the east. Unalaska Island and Umnak Island have sheep and horses. Umnak, I believe, also has cattle, and the people there introduced bison because they're trying to attract tourists for an economy and hunting. And then there are some other islands off the Alaska Peninsula that had cattle on them. Most of the cattle have been removed, except off of, I think, Chirikov Island still has feral cattle. Chernabura Island had them. They've been removed. But yeah, cattle are really rough. Grazing animals in an environment that isn't designed for grazing animals. They're really hard.
Well, speaking of cows, the saddest part of the book for me, well, one of the saddest parts was the hunting of sea cows. And I didn't know what a sea cow was. So I had to like Google it on my phone because it's extinct.
It's extinct.
But it was like a very sweet animal that they ate and they overhunt. I mean, we're talking about, it wasn't the Unangax people. It was the Russians.
Yeah. They're huge. They're like manatees, but they were huge. They were 30 feet long. These things were monsters. They have no teeth. They eat seaweed.
They're like gentle giants of the sea.
They just float around and eat seaweed. And Stellar was with Bering on his voyage, and they were wrecked in the Commander Islands. And Stellar described these sea cows. Well,
like the 1700s.
Yeah, 1740, I think. The Russians washed up on this island. They had scurvy. They were dying. They were just completely debilitated. They were fortunate not to be killed when they crashed on the island. And they were scraping out a miserable living because what to eat? There's no land animals. And Stellar was an annoying, pompous jerk. So the crew members wouldn't listen to it. He said, you've got to eat these plants or you die of scurvy. And then these big, giant animals are bobbing around in the bay. It was very hard to kill them because their skin was so thick and they're immensely strong. Well, they eventually figured out how to kill them, which was you stick a harpoon in them, and they were so strong they could unbend an iron hook. And you'd stick a harpoon in them, then they'd get a boat behind them and they'd chase them to the beach and then butcher them. And they tasted amazing because they ate plants. They didn't taste like fish. And so that became the Russian expeditions to the Aleutians would stop in the Commander Islands to provision themselves with sea cow meat. There were probably only 3,000 or so of these.
So it didn't take long for them to kill them all.
And they probably bred one calf every 3 or 4 years. So, and they lost as many as they actually captured. And so I think it took them 26 years to wipe out.
There's so much of this section of the book that I found fascinating. I love the part about sharks and all the different types of sharks that were there. The whale fall poem. You included some poetry in the book. It was just so interesting. And then the cod eating birds diving under and the fish eating them. And then a whole section on the Unangax who are actually fishing for birds.
Yes.
It was super fascinating. But I actually want to get to talking about the people. It's sort of the more, the second half of the book, the war between the Unangax people themselves. I don't know if you could speak about that.
Sure. These are people who were trained from birth to kill things. And it's not easy for people to do that. There's a lot you have to go through. And animals were intelligent, self-aware, they have volition. Basically, if you kill an animal, the animal has given itself to you. So from killing a sea lion to killing a human is not that big of a step. And they were raised to be fairly aggressive. They were prickly about their status and their privilege. And there were also territorial, your village owned these resources. Trespassers were a danger to the survival of the group. So warfare was pretty common. And it ranged from feuds between individuals to full-on warfare, which was interesting to me because I knew about war parties. You'd go over, you'd raid somebody, you'd steal a kayak or a couple of women and dash back home. But a concerted, we are going to war with this village. And then you would plan and you would round up your war party and you would go and carry out a war. And they would destroy whole villages. And most of this is not visible in archaeology, although you do see occasional spear point wounds, trauma wounds on people. The folklore is full of these stories. And the weapon to kill a sea lion is the same one to kill a human. But there's all this inherent power in a person or an animal that is dangerous to release. So they took steps. And one of the things that, as I was analyzing the spear points and the harpoon points and things, is the very elaborate, when you're hunting a very dangerous animal like a whale or a human, the tool you use is part of your weaponry. The more elaborate you make that, the more decorated it is, the more powerful it is. So the spear points for killing humans are really intricate. And because humans can get rid of things that are sticking in them, they were designed to, one, shatter if they hit. Long, thin barbs that would splinter off and break. But they also would barb things in different directions so that you couldn't push the spear point through or pull it out. It was just, you had to dig the thing out. And they're also usually bigger than a sea lion spear. So the goal was to kill and to loot. It was a stratified society. So you talked
about all the roles, all the way down to slave,
rank.
which I think, that jumps out to you as somebody who doesn't know about this culture very much. The fact that they had slaves.
They had slaves. I found it interesting that there was a class they weren't slaves, but they were people without relatives who were just a hair above slaves.
Well,
because they were your own neighbors.
Right.
They were freeborn. They were, but orphans or a widow or.
Well, and then I wonder also, you talked about the 4 genders. And so I'm thinking that perhaps some of them were the 3rd or 4th gender.
Yeah. We know nothing about the role of
the women who
were becoming men.
Uh-huh.
The Russians were incensed, of course, with men. They called them perversions, and they said that people raised boys to be concubines.
Right.
But that's not how the Aleuts saw it. You were born the way you were. And then when you reach puberty, you manifested that aspect. And in Kodiak, I had to use Kodiak as an analog a lot because there's a little more known about some of these things. In Kodiak, the boys becoming women were a bridge between the spiritual world and the human world. And they were often shamans. They saw things. They were poets. They were the artists. So it was an important role in the society. It wasn't an anomaly, and it wasn't something parents tried to have their kids. They didn't groom children to become this. It was achieving the potential they had been born with. And I wish we could know more about that. There is one story about a woman who disguised herself as a man so that she could sleep with her granddaughter. But that is not the woman becoming man. And we have no stories about that role. I suspect they have the same position where they were an intermediary between the spirit world and the human world, and between animals and humans.
One thing you said earlier, you talked about, I guess, 100 years ago, about trying to bring in livestock, and it was a concerted effort to try to make them civilized. But I wanted to point out that in the book, you do a good job of explaining that we no longer consider hunter-gatherer societies to be primitive. They're just as intricate and rich as agrarian societies.
Yes. It took a lifetime to become an accomplished hunter. You had to learn your boat. You had to learn the currents. You basically knew everything about the animal you were hunting. And some people specialized, but most people were getting whatever they could get. So you needed to know when the animals were breeding. You needed to know their behavior when they were breeding. You needed to know where they went when they weren't breeding. How did sea lions behave during breeding season versus pupping versus just living? Male herds versus the breeding.
When you talk about specialization, specifically whale hunters were a very specific group.
Yes.
And it was basically you needed all the other groups to be very functional in order for you to be able to support
a whale hunter. Yeah, that's not the pattern on the North Slope. Whale hunting supports
everything else,
the society and the whole culture. In the Aleutians, whale hunting was expensive, it's hard, and not everyone could do it. So the whale hunters were basically subsidized. It was a subsidized economic activity. They also considered if a whale washed ashore, that was because it's conceptualized as somebody had called that whale ashore. And that was considered hunting as well, which was an interesting concept that they could, perform whatever rituals and access their spirit helpers to get a whale to wash ashore.
the book has so much in it. There's like no possible way that we can do the book justice, but housing and just getting back to this idea of bringing in sheep and cattle, it's really problematic when you have sunken homes that have grass growing on the roofs.
Yes.
That you're going to have heavy animals walking on top
Yes.
and destroying the homes.
Yes.
So I guess describe the types of homes that were built.
When I started this, Diane said, let's write a book. And I thought, okay, how hard can that be? I've never written a book before. I thought I'll start with the section on houses. Because how hard can it be? They lived in semi-subterranean houses. They'd dig out a hole, and then they weren't completely underground, but down a couple feet, dig out a hole, and then put in the superstructure. And house building is very patterned. So the Aleuts had a 4-post system. So there were 4 posts in the house, and then cross beams, and then the roof. And it basically, when it was done, they'd put in smaller poles and then grass over the poles, and then put dirt on that. And then eventually the grass would grow up on the roof. So they looked like hills.
And you entered through a hatch or
Through the roof, which they're the only people in Alaska who entered through the roof. Every other group in Alaska enters through the side. So that's interesting. Where did that come from?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they entered through the roof, and the fire pit in the house was slightly offset. So you can't walk down
into the fire
pit. Yeah. Instead of having the
fire in the center into the side.
Yeah. So their fireplaces are always a little offside. But they have thick sod walls. And then the inside they put, one man told me he built a hunting camp where he lined the inside with a cedar log he found on the beach, and he split off planks and but they would line the walls with matting, woven tapestries. They put grass on the floor, which there was, after that got disgusting, they'd scoop that up and throw it out and put new grass on the floor. But it's great for archaeologists because you can't find anything you drop on the floor in a house. And when your lighting is lamps, basically a good candle, you're not going to find stuff on the floor. So archaeologists love to find floors.
Because there's stuff there.
There's stuff there. And they also put small holes in the floors that had stone lids on them where they would store things. Your sewing kit, your tool kit would be there. There were roasting pits in the floors in the bigger houses. The standard house was about 9 meters long and a family, an extended family, maybe 15 people would live in there. In the Eastern Aleutians and in the later periods, houses could get very large, huge. And some of them on Alaska had 300 to 500 people.
Like the long houses.
The long houses.
You know, yeah. I have to say, I would get to a new chapter, and I'd be like, oh, okay, we're going to talk about housing. And I would get through the first few pages, like, oh, I understand this. And then, like, there's a new kind of house, and then a new kind of house, and then a new kind of house. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many kinds of houses.
Well, and they all come with political, social, and economic implications. So if you have a single house, this is an economic unit. If you put 2 families in this house, you've got a completely different economic and social unit. If you've got 500 people living in a house, that's a completely different economic and social unit. So when you see these house changes, you're looking at system-wide changes in the whole society, which we don't understand very well.
Well, you just said 500, and I think this is something that came up in the Mike Livingston interview about that there were a lot of people living in the Aleutian chain until the Russians came, and there was a massive decrease in population.
The standard population estimate for the Aleutians is about 30,000 people. And this is all based, I go through it in the book. It's all based on Father Veniaminov, who talked to the old people, collected the historic information, tried to figure out how many people were there. Now, he was talking specifically about the Unalaska district, which were the Eastern Islands. And he talked to the older Aleuts, and they said, well, there used to be a lot of people here, this many people in each village, blah, blah, blah. And he took that information. He said, no, that's not right. He cut it in half.
He refused to believe the number.
He refused to believe the number. And so he cut that in half and got about 25,000 people, I think. People since then have applied that 25,000 people to the whole chain.
Got it.
So it's really hard. It's basically impossible
to find the true,
find a true number. But of course, I had to try. So based it on the number of houses, how many people could live in a house, how many houses there are in a village at any given time, and I came up with a ridiculously high number. I think it was 130,000. And I thought, that number scares me a little, so I'll cut it in half. And I think when the Russians got there, I think there were probably about 80,000 people that would have considered themselves Aleut Unangax, living from Attu to about Port Moller on the Alaska Peninsula. There could have been more. I think one of the limiting factors is skin boats. Hunters have to have a boat, and a single man kayak took 3 sea lion skins. It had to be recovered every year. So
it's a lot of work.
That's a lot of work. It's a lot of sea lions. And so they invented the 2-hatch bidarkas, which only took 5 skins for 2 men. And they also used the bidars, the open boats, which carried more men. So there's we call it intensification. They're trying to get more out of what they have. So I think one of the limiting factors would be the number of sea lions or seals you could kill to cover a boat. You need a lot more seals to cover a boat. And then there are bad times. The population grows to where it can be sustained by the minimum amount of resources in the area. Another thing we've underestimated is the amount of whales people were eating. We find whale bones in every site. But people say, well, you don't know if they were scavenged or if they were hunted. Doesn't matter. If a whale washed up on the beach, it was used. And the condition of the meat is almost irrelevant because they were used to eating meats that were fermented. They were used to eating things that were a little off. And the fat, you can always render the fat. I think if you look at everything, all the resources and all of the potential for the Aleutians, 30,000 people is a ridiculously low number, especially when you look at the complexity of that culture with the ranked society, 500 people in a house. Alaska had 30, 35 villages that had hundreds of people in every village. Umnak had the same thing. And then they all said that Unangax Island, which is the biggest one, was the most populous island. So there's a lot of political and social reasons we underestimate the number of Native Americans in any area, because if there weren't very many, then we really didn't do anything bad by replacing them. But also the effects of European intrusion happened before they actually saw any Europeans. So smallpox, the flu killed millions, measles, chickenpox. The Russians' greatest gift was tuberculosis, and that gets in everyone. Everyone's got it, and you can live with tuberculosis, but if you get another disease, then it explodes.
You're going to die. Yeah.
There were parts of this that were very hard to write.
The population sort of hit a low after the Russians, like the lowest ever.
The lowest
How
ever.
low did it go?
I believe down to about 6,000 people. The Russians did not report a lot of epidemics. But I've been analyzing the Russian records and looking at warfare. The Russian intrusion into the Aleutians was a violent conquest. It wasn't just hunters showing up living with Aleuts and some scattered interpersonal violence. It was a conquest. And they'd conquered Siberia with a handful of men. So they had it down. And you go in, you terror, murder, captives, extortion, and they applied that in the Aleutians. And I mean, whole villages would gone. And they didn't just kill people, they would destroy boats, weapons.
They would burn everything.
Scorched earth. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then when the people surrendered and it's like, please, we've had enough, then everything was fine.
To conclude, in the beginning of the book, and I may have remember wrong because that was a long time ago, but at the beginning of the book, I felt like part of the goal was to correct some mythology around the Unangax Aleut people. Mm-hmm. But then at the end you say, but that wasn't our whole purpose. We really want to present new information.
Yes.
It's not just about correcting mistakes, but it's about just presenting all of the new things that we're continuing to learn.
Yes. Yeah. We joked about calling it Mythbusters because Herdlischka and Bill Laughlin built this picture of Aleutian culture and Aleutian prehistory. And because there had been no other serious work, it came in spurts. About every 30 years, you get another blast. There'd been no other work, and people would go out there and just, confirmation bias, you mentioned earlier, they'd go out there and say, yes, we see it all here. Mm-hmm. And we were trying to look at what the data actually said, which is very different than a fairly simple story of people who moved in to a rich, interesting area and built a successful society, but, it wasn't really that exciting, or it's just a nice, steady progression. And we see different areas developing their own traditions. We see influences coming in from outside. I think Diane talks about Arctic small tool tradition and Norton tradition, and these are all Eskimo developments, other places in Alaska that end up in the Aleutians. And then, things like masking. The wooden artifacts from the caves look very much like things from Kodiak, or even from Southeast Alaska, or from the Yupik area. So we've got a really dynamic system and a really dynamic culture that is fully interacting with everybody around it.
I want people to check out the book. I'll just say some other things we didn't get to talk about, the pteroglyphs, which is, I guess there's only the one example, but it's like the idea that it was a bunch of female genitalia. It may or may not be female genitalia, but that just to spark people's interest, read the book.
Read the book.
And multiple wives for chiefs.
Yes.
That did leap out to me.
Yes. Well, and some women had multiple husbands.
Interesting.
Because they were considered, one, she was considered really buff because she could supply more than one man with clothing and everything he needed to live. So, yeah, they're one of the few cultures on Earth that allowed women to marry multiple men. But yeah, men having multiple wives. And again, a powerful chief would marry this chief's daughter. The political marriages, they were doing everything Henry VIII was doing on their islands. And the women one of the ways to power is to give things away. So the women manufactured wealth that the men used to build their power and their status, which won't get into that, but that's been a consistent pattern in human history too, is women manufacturing wealth that the men then use for political purposes. Raising children, having babies, it's all cooking, food preparation, storing food, it's all in there.
Debbie Corbett, thank you so much for your work, your 10 years of work on this book. It's amazing. I don't know why somebody wouldn't be interested in culture, but if they weren't, just the first 100 pages on
plate tectonics and the animals and the way the animals interact and the way the animals have changed over time and the animal behavior, the cod eating the birds. It's just like my mind was blown.
Yes.
It's such a crazy, really interesting book, and I encourage folks to check it out.
Oh, good.
Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklug.gov or call 907-269-0123.